Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for providing us with this opportunity to participate in this very influential forum in the Security Council. Special thanks go to the government of Sweden, who invited us in the first place and enabled us to make the trip from Colombia to New York. And thanks also go to the special representative of the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict. Now, I've been using the plural form we because I sit here today as the chosen delegate of the group of youth advisors on children and adolescents in armed conflict. And so I would like you to see me as speaking on behalf of those many boys, girls and adolescents who around the world suffer the tragedy of recruitment and use by armed groups and other violations of their rights. In my modest way, I would like to be their voice. Under the slogan, Our Voices Count, a group of more than 30 young people who as children were recruited in Colombia by various armed groups, came together to set up the Group of Youth Advisors, an initiative that finds its roots in the brainwave of a civil society organization, Ben Poster, and which benefits from the financial support of the European Union, together with the recognition, support and backing of other organizations who work alongside Ben Poster, such as Oxfam Intermon, Humanidad Vigente, Coalico, and here in New York, Watchlist on Children and Armed Conflict. To tell you my story, I ended up in the ranks of FARC-EP when I was just 13 years old. I freed myself from their service in very odd and unusual circumstances after having seen combat, and I spent time subsequently in various programs. Today I'm pursuing law studies. I'm currently in my 9th term. In 2014, I had the opportunity to be part of the victims delegation sitting around the table at the Havana talks between the Colombian government and FARC-EP, in my capacity as a former victim of child recruitment. I would like to thank all those countries who are present in this chamber today for their readiness to hear me and hear my message. That's important because the message I bear is aimed principally at states, because it is you who are responsible for designing and implementing policies aimed at conflict prevention and protecting boys, girls and young people in places where armed conflict is rampant. As the Secretary General of the United Nations pointed out in his recent report, preventing violations against children affected by conflict must be a priority for the international community. And he further emphasized that we must redouble our efforts to face head-on this problem, ensuring the protection of children is an integral part of any broader strategy of prevention and conflict resolution. In order to achieve lasting peace, and also we must encourage the participation of children in the design of these broad prevention and conflict resolution strategies. So in that understanding, I have been charged with bringing the following recommendations to your attention as a spokesperson. It is essential that the root causes that led to our joining the armed groups in the first place be addressed, since there is a common thread to all of our stories as former child soldiers. It is that of the abuse of our rights, such as access to education, healthcare, housing, the abuse of the right of employment and livelihood for our families. We have also seen our right to security, participation in society and access to recreation violated as well or breached. We are worried that as long as there is no change for the better in the economic and social conditions of our families and our communities, our social reintegration is made all the harder because there is a constant temptation for us to rejoin the ranks of these groups simply as a way of surviving. I would therefore like to emphasize that the best way of preventing the recruitment of children is by guaranteeing our rights at the grassroots level in our home communities and the rights of our families as well. It is also essential for governments to uphold those security conditions that protect our physical, personal and psychological integrity. Unfortunately, many children and adolescents who have been separated from or broken free of armed groups run straight away into problems, including threats, when they return to their home communities and towns. And often there is a complete dearth of the requisite institutional support at that community level. And whatever support there may be there is woefully inadequate. It is also crucial that at every stage of the process of reintegration, those of us who, as children or young people, were members of these groups, are given the right to speak up and to make our own life choices, guaranteeing that reintegrated children and young people are involved in the design and implementation of public policies related to our rights. Educational programs, psychological support, capacity building, and comprehensive education must address our unique needs, and they must therefore be gender and ethnicity sensitive in order to ensure that we can exercise our rights, including the right to social reintegration and inclusion, education, housing, and all other rights in a spirit of dignity, respecting our own career aspirations that we should be free to choose for ourselves. In designing reintegration programs, it's important to meet the specific needs of girls, given that the way in which we are affected by armed conflict as girls is distinct from the experience of boys. It's important to bear in mind that as far as reintegration is concerned, each child and young person must be treated as an individual, not subject to a one-size-fits-all process. I would also like to recall the point that our families should be included in this process, and to the extent possible, they should participate in that process of reintegration as part of a broader process to repair, rebuild, and strengthen ties that will allow for reintegration into our families and our communities. We are deeply concerned that schools and educational establishments are being targeted and/or occupied by armed actors, which severely disrupts the schooling of children and young people and harms their physical integrity as well as that of teachers and professors. And we thus urge governments that have not yet signed the Safe Schools Declaration to do so. And I would make the point that we have made this request to Colombia, but that an answer to that request has been pending since 2015, and Colombia is not alone. We appeal to governments to live up to their commitments to children and young people, including the right of children and young people to be recognized as victims and thus to enjoy comprehensive reparation and compensation. In situations of conflict, many children, due to our ties to armed groups and our identification with armed groups' activities, are treated as criminals. There is a failure to prioritize our status as victims of a crime rather than criminals, and to ensure that we have access to government programs for the protection of boys and girls. Quite the contrary, we often end up in detention centers. I think it worth underscoring that Colombia has enacted the Victims' Law, providing an advanced and sophisticated legal framework for protection of victims. This framework, the Victims' Law, could make a major contribution to the exchange of best practices and lessons learned between countries who are faced with similar problems. And it could serve to underscore the importance of guaranteeing that all children be treated first and foremost as victims of recruitment. Finally, on the issue of comprehensive reparation and compensation, regrettably, many of my friends and companions in the advisors group, 10 years after having left a given armed group and having been recognized as separated from some armed groups, still do not have access to the resources that are due under the Victims' Law in Colombia. It is vital that all state actors live up to their obligations to children and young people separated from armed groups. All must work to implement and abide by these plans that are intended to provide support for child victims. And if this is not done, this will seriously affect the futures of these children and young people. It will re-victimize them and leave them at risk. We welcome once again the fact that children and young people who have been victims of recruitment have been heard in this chamber, and we hope that what we have to say through me will be paid heed to. I ask governments not to see us as a problem, but rather give us the opportunity to show you that our ability to be change makers, as we in the group of young advisors have been striving to do in Colombia. That's what we want to be, change makers for society. To conclude, I would like to emphasize just how happy and delighted I feel to be here, sat around this table in this chamber, to share with you my own experience, what I went through at 13 years old when I was recruited by the FARC. The reality is that many of us who are recruited live in very remote areas where the state has a weak presence, and that's why we fall so easily prey to these armed groups. It's not fair for children to be seen as a criminal or to be a risk element. Rather, what we need to be seen is a hope for the future. I'd like to share with you all the happy news that I'm currently pregnant, which gives me a further opportunity and further impetus to change this world, not just for me, but for my child, so that he or she may be born in a better world. I see that as my responsibility. I hope that you see that as your responsibility, because you have the tools to make the world better for all those children who do not have a voice. Thank you very much.